Hello and welcome to my newspaper evolution project presentation for JMS 472 in fall of 2022. I'm Adam Correa. I'm doing the evolution of the New York Times. The first edition came out on September 18th, 1851, and it wasn't called the New York Times, it was called the New York Daily Times. No ads are displayed on the front page, just a bunch of text. The top left of the newspaper talks about their other New York Times editions, for example, the Evening Times and Weekly Times. The big news story that covers half of the front page is a story about the news from Europe. There was an election happening in France, and the story also covered what else was happening in other European countries. So 95% editorial and 5% advertisement. The only ad really is the New York Times displaying how much the paper costs, which is displayed on the top right, which says 1 cent. The second front page I'm covering for the New York Times was from April 15th, 1912. In 1857, it changed from the Daily Times to the New York Times, and then the now official name in this newspaper is called the New York Times starting in 1890 with the use of different type font. This newspaper came out a day after the Titanic sank, and we get our first picture, which was a picture of the White Star Liner Titanic. I would say 90% editorial and 10% advertisement. The only ads I see are of their Sunday Times displayed in the top middle and in the top right displaying a weather report for New York. More stories are displayed on this front page talking about the news of the Titanic, but very well organized and easy to read. The third front page I'm covering was from December 8th, 1941. This was during the time of World War II, and this newspaper came out the day after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. And the newest thing I observed was the use of bigger headlines. This headline says, Japan wars on US and Britain, makes sudden attack on Hawaii, heavy fighting at sea reported. We also get a bigger picture used in comparison to the photo of the White Star Liner Titanic in the 1912 edition. It shows the different islands either the US or Japan attacked within the Pacific Ocean. Still barely any ads. The price of the newspaper went up from 1 cent to 3 cents. Displayed in the top right, but in the bottom left it shows how the New York Times has its own radio show, which is something new. Most of the stories contain news about the war and the United States involvement. One different tactic used was curving around stories. For example, the Tokyo bomber story kind of curved around another story, which is something I observed to be new. The final New York Times newspaper I'm going over was from December 31st, 2002. Now, I know there were definitely printed newspapers that came out after 2002, but this was the last printed newspaper from the New York Times archived on their website. So, the first thing I noticed was the use of multiple pictures. The first picture shows Kenya's president, Daniel Arap Moi, retiring, shaking the hands of the new president of Kenya. Then you have a picture of the ball dropping in Times Square since it is New Year's Eve. On the bottom right, there's a picture of a man with a skeleton. The new things I noticed were a barcode is displayed on the bottom middle so the newspaper stands can scan a paper that you buy, and then right next to it is a little table of contents of where you can find other sections of the newspaper. Another thing I noticed was the prioritization of more important stories and giving them bigger headlines, and less important stories got smaller headlines. That's all the time I have. Thank you for listening to the evolution of the New York Times.